everybody, it's been a while since I've done a video because I've been sick over the past couple of weeks and I've been working on the review for Pathfinder Kingmaker, which is still a ways out, so I guess stay tuned for that later on. Although I still can't give you an exact release date for that particular review because it's a particularly long game. It's roughly 100+ hours long, and that's not even doing everything in the game. And they just released the Enhanced Edition update, which means I gotta do all kinds of backtracking and see how things have changed. Point is that it's a process that's taking quite a while, so that'll be out when it's out, but until then you're probably going to be seeing mostly MTOs, like this one here, where I'll be talking about my thoughts on E3 for this year, because that just happened, and it's actually technically still going on as I'm recording this video, but at this point all the big conferences and live streams have been completed, so I feel pretty comfortable giving my thoughts on the show overall. And we'll go ahead and take it one conference at a time, starting in chronological order with the EA Play event that actually occurred before the main festivities began, and we'll go from there. Now, if I did miss something, because there were a bunch of miscellaneous announcements that I might have missed, then go ahead and just throw that in the comments, and I'll take a look and see what I can find out, and go ahead and respond to you in the comments. But as for what I'll be talking about in this video, it's what was explicitly shown in the conferences at E3, as well as the additional announcements that I did notice. So let's go ahead and start with the EA Play event, where the only thing really of note there was Jedi Fallen Order. They finally showed an actual gameplay presentation, and a fairly decent length too, and I came away from that just going, okay, it looks like a fairly standard action-adventure game. It could be okay, but I highly doubt it'll be worth full price. I will, of course, review it after it's out, but I'm not sure if I'll pick it up at full price, so it may not be around the time of the game's release. It may be a bit after that, but suffice to say, it certainly looks at least better than the other two Star Wars games that EA has done, which is to say, just Battlefront 1 and 2 reboot, both of which were absolute trash. So we'll see how it goes, but I'm not exactly all that excited about it, especially when the gameplay presentation they showed just looked okay, and the trailer they showed later on during the Microsoft Conference showed actually more of the level than what they actually showed in the gameplay demo, and the other parts of the level looked way more interesting than what they actually showed in the gameplay presentation. So, seems like a missed opportunity there. Maybe we'll see more closer to the game's release, and maybe it'll look a lot better by then, but right now it's just an okay-looking game. The rest of the stuff they showed at the EA Play event, oh dear. Well, we got another FIFA, we got another Madden, we got yet another expansion for The Sims 4, whoop-de-doodle-doo, and Battlefield 5 is getting a new map that's infantry-focused, because what you want in your Combined Arms game is more infantry maps. Great idea, guys. Oh, and they also teased that they're going to be doing the Pacific Theater eventually, but at this point, who cares? Battlefield 5 is absolute garbage, and it's not going to get better by them just putting more stuff in it. And speaking of new content for stuff that's not really going to make it all that much better, Apex Legends' new season is on its way, and I really don't care. It's a battle royale game. Why should I care about it? They're basically a dime a dozen these days. And if you don't like that core gameplay loop of jumping into a very large map and then being gunned down almost immediately by somebody who just got really lucky on where they dropped and what they found, then you're not going to like Apex Legends either. So, there's not really much to talk about there. So let's actually go ahead and move on to the Microsoft Conference, because there wasn't really all that much else they showed at the EA Play event, other than they teased a few new EA Originals titles, which are their semi-indie games, which were Lost in Random, Rust Heart, and they said that something from the Way Out developers is in development, but they didn't really show anything, they just mentioned them, so that was actually really disappointing. So what about Microsoft? Well, Microsoft was interesting because it basically took the place of both the Microsoft and Sony conference this year, because Sony did not actually have an event at E3 this year. It's the first year that they've gone without doing so, and I think it's because they just didn't have anything to show. I mean, think about it this way. What have they got in the works? They've got The Last of Us Part 2, which they're playing very, very close to the chest. They've got Ghost of Tsushima, which they showed off a fair bit of, but again, they're playing pretty close to the chest on that. And they've got the upcoming PS5. And that's pretty much it. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head that Sony's got in the works. So they probably just don't have enough to put together a conference for. That said, with Microsoft going ahead and dropping Project Scarlet with their particular conference and outright saying, hey, we're working on a new console, these are going to be some of the things that you can look forward to, and it's going to be coming out in holiday 2020, Sony's going to have to respond to that, and I think they're probably going to do that next year at E3. And of course, maybe by then they'll actually have something to show. But as for what was actually shown in the Microsoft conference, there wasn't really all that much that was actually new. They were things that we had seen before, but maybe just not had seen a lot of, with of course the very big thing being Cyberpunk 2077, which I've been pumped for since they announced it back in 2013 actually, and they revealed that not only is Johnny Silverhand in the game, which if you're not familiar with Cyberpunk is one of the big iconic characters in the Cyberpunk universe, but he's also being played by Keanu Reeves, which is gonna be really interesting. I'm not sure how that's gonna work out, because when I think Johnny Silverhand, I don't necessarily think Keanu Reeves, but he's not a bad choice. We'll see how it actually works out in-game, and how they actually play that out. But suffice to say, the release date is big. It comes out next year. I'm pumped. I'm gonna be getting it day one, and I will be reviewing it as soon as I possibly can. In fact, I'll probably do the same thing I'm doing with Kingmaker right now, where I'll basically drop everything else for the time being and then just focus almost exclusively on Cyberpunk at that point. So the release date for Cyberpunk was definitely the biggest announcement at the Microsoft conference, but they also had a few other things that were really neat. For example, they did finally show Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, which I will be picking up and I will be doing an MTO on as soon as I can. And they showed Wasteland 3, which I basically expected because Microsoft acquired inXile Entertainment, and so they'll be publishing it from here on out. Now, that will be coming to PC. I will be reviewing it as soon as I can, but since we don't have an exact release date for it yet, I just don't know when that's going to be. They did also show a new trailer for Psychonauts 2, which does actually show a bit of gameplay, so definitely looking forward to that, but again, no solid release date quite yet, so we'll see how that goes. And of course, they showed a new CGI trailer for Halo Infinite, which is also going to be a launch title for their new console, currently codenamed Project Scarlet. I certainly won't be picking it up on console, however, since they are actually bringing it to PC this time around, and they are also working on getting the Master Chief Collection on PC, and bringing Reach to PC, which is a big deal because all of these games would be so much better with a keyboard and mouse, and a field of view that doesn't make me want to vomit. But then we move on into other things that they were showing at the Microsoft conference that are either just middling or things that I didn't even really care about all that much at all. Like, for example, Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I played Ori and the Blind Forest and just didn't really care for it, so I'm not really excited for that one, although I know a lot of people are really excited for it. I mean, it looks great and it sounds great, but I'm just not a platformer guy. Bleeding Edge could be interesting, but I'm reserving judgment until I play it. Online melee action can be really messy if you do it wrong, so we'll just have to wait and see on that. 12 Minutes looks conceptually interesting, but I'm curious to see how the execution is. Blair Witch is just another damn horror game that I can't even care about at all. There's yet another Dragon Ball Z game where all you do is go through the Z storyline all over again. I've lost track of the number of games that do that. I don't know how they keep getting away with it. Is it just that Dragon Ball fans just want to play the exact same game over and over and over again? Because that's what it seems like. And speaking of doing the exact same thing over and over and over again, Minecraft Dungeons, which is basically a Diablo clone version of Minecraft, which I couldn't even possibly care about if I tried. There was a CGI trailer for Crossfire X, which I'm guessing is a free-to-play shooter of some kind, but it's hard to tell because the CGI trailer tells you absolutely nothing about how the game actually is. There was a trailer for Borderlands 3, which I couldn't possibly care about if I tried. There was a CGI trailer for Elden Ring, which could be really interesting, but the problem is it's a From Software game, and they've basically been railroaded into making Souls-like games for a while now, and I'm hoping they actually try something truly different. They showed a trailer for Dying Light 2, which I don't really care all that much about because it's a zombie game, but it does have Chris Avellone working on it, and apparently they're trying to work in some choice and consequence, so I may end up checking it out. They announced a crossover between Forza Horizon 4 and LEGO, which I don't care about racing games at all, but even then, that seems really, really weird. and they announced a new Tales game, which I have a lot of catching up to do on that series. The last one I played was Vesperia, and I didn't play very much of it. So I have quite a lot of catching up to do before I get around to playing another new Tales game. In fact, I've got Tales of Xillia, I need to get Tales of Xillia 2, I need to get Tales of Grace's F, I've got Berseria to go through, I've got Zestiria to go through. I got a lot of stuff to do before I get to Tales of Arise, but hey, it's nice that they actually remembered that series exists beyond just remastering the old games. They showed off some of the new Battletoads game, which I guess is cool if you like Battletoads, but I was never really a big fan of it. And they announced a new Microsoft Flight Simulator, which actually kind of blows my mind. I thought they had completely forgotten they even owned that franchise, because the last one we saw was in 2006. But they're bringing it back, and if you're a big flight enthusiast, then I guess that's a big deal for you. But I've never really gotten all that much out of just basic flight simulation like that. I've always been much more of a space sim kind of guy. I cut my teeth on things like X-Wing and TIE Fighter back in the day. So if you're like me and you're a fan of those old space sims and such, then you've been pretty starved for space sims lately. But it is nice for people who are big fans of the Microsoft Flight Sim series, because they're actually finally getting a proper follow-up to Flight Sim X. So while the new Microsoft Flight Sim is not on my radar at all, I'm definitely glad for those of you who are looking forward to something like that, because you're finally getting it. But it's just not something I'm interested in, so I won't be taking a look at it for the channel. As for other things that they showed at this particular conference, they did their typical ID at Xbox montage of a bunch of smaller indie games that they were supporting, and I mean, most of those we had already seen. They're just either being ported over to Xbox One, or they were releasing this year and we already knew about them. They announced the Xbox Game Pass for PC, which is a pretty interesting move. I'm curious to see how it turns out, because it's ultimately going to be replacing Xbox Live Gold, and it's cross-platform, so you get it both on Xbox One and on PC, and presumably whenever Project Scarlet comes out, it'll also be on that. Now, to be fair, right now there's not all that much benefit for it if you get it for PC, but we will probably be seeing more benefit from that when they actually do start bringing more of their titles to PC. Like, we've got the upcoming Gears 5, which they made a big deal about at this year's conference, but I honestly don't care about it because it's Gears of War, and I'm just not all that interested in the series, really. And of course, we got the upcoming Halo Infinite. It might have something to do with, say, Age of Empires Definitive Edition stuff. We'll just have to wait and see how it turns out, because, again, right now it's primarily geared towards Xbox One. They did show they're working on a new version of the Xbox Elite controller, which is nice if you have one, but I'm still running a standard Xbox One pad on my PC, so I don't really care all that much. And of course, they announced something pretty big if you're into MMOs, which is that Phantasy Star Online 2 is finally coming to the West, and it's not just coming on PC, but it's also going to be on Xbox One. And I'm not really all that excited for it because I don't like MMOs, and more importantly, it's an MMO that released in 2012, but it's been going pretty strong the entire time, and of course Phantasy Star Online is a very popular series for a reason. People really like those games if they're into MMOs, so obviously your mileage is going to vary on that, but I do know some people who were really looking forward to Phantasy Star Online 2 when it was announced, but they were really disappointed when it just never came to the West, so maybe they'll finally be able to actually go back and mess around with it and find out whether they like it. That's not really my thing, and I'm not going to look at it on the channel, but it's just interesting to see that they didn't forget about it, so that's nice. But then, of course, there was The Outer Worlds, which is a game that I've been looking forward to, until they announced that it's a timed exclusive on the Epic Games Store. Now, the Epic Games Store is something I will get to. I'm going to get to it during the PC Gaming Show, because that's when it was most egregious. But as for The Outer Worlds, it means that I'm still going to be picking it up and taking a look at it. It's just that it'll be a year after the game's original release. Now, I have a feeling that the Epic Games Store exclusivity deal for The Outer Worlds is much like with Ancestors: The Humankind Odyssey, where the publisher decided they would do that, which was Private Division, instead of the actual developers themselves, because Obsidian is now actually a subsidiary of Microsoft, so while The Outer Worlds is still being published under Private Division, anything going forward from Obsidian will be under Microsoft, and Microsoft has a deal going with Steam. So we'll see how that turns out in the long run, because that's ultimately going to be one of those long run kind of things where you have to look at the data over a considerable margin of time to really make any judgments on how Epic Game Store is really affecting the PC landscape. But suffice to say, it's definitely pretty irritating from a consumer perspective. But other than that, that was really the entire Microsoft conference. It was fairly average as far as the general conferences tend to go for E3. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't particularly great either. There were a lot of CGI trailers and not a whole lot of gameplay, which is really just par for the course. Which is something I certainly can't say for the Bethesda Conference, which obviously didn't have a whole lot big to show because there are two big things that would have really drawn people in, Starfield and Elder Scrolls 6, they explicitly stated were not going to be at this year's E3 conference. So what did they have instead? Well, obviously they talked about Wolfenstein's Cyberpilot and Youngblood, both of which are coming out a bit later on this year. In fact, they're coming out in about a month. Now, I'm not going to be picking up either of them on release. In fact, I'm not going to be picking up Cyberpilot at all because I don't have any VR stuff. But I'll be picking up Youngblood eventually. I just don't know when that's going to be. It's not really something I'm optimistic about, considering how awful Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus was. But we'll just have to wait and see on that. There's, of course, Elder Scrolls Legends, which is a card game I do not care about. There was DLC for Rage 2, which I haven't even picked up the base game yet, and I probably won't for a while, so I don't really care about that right now. And then, of course, they talked about a new expansion for the Elder Scrolls Online, and I'm sure by now you've probably noticed the background noise that I've been playing throughout this entire bit. It's because that's how the conference was. These people were just constantly going, "Woo, yeah!" and just never shutting the hell up and letting the people say what they were trying to say. It was exceptionally obnoxious, and if it was that irritating for people who were actually viewing the conference from the live streams and such, I can only imagine how annoying it was in person. And keep in mind, I was being merciful in the fact that I had it turned to a pretty low volume so it wasn't interrupting what I was saying, it was just background noise. But in their case, they were actually interrupting what the people were saying, and it was just, oh, it was infuriating. Anyway, other things they talked about were things like the Elder Scrolls Blades coming to Switch, which means that I guess I'll finally be able to do a video on that, even though there is absolutely no chance in hell of it even being the slightest bit decent because it's a loot box filled mobile game designed explicitly to get as much cash out of the player as possible. And speaking of mobile game cash grabs, they decided to revive the Commander Keen series as a mobile cash grab. Congratulations, Bethesda, you pulled an EA. I hope you're happy with yourselves. Anyway, they did announce that there is a new game from Arcane in development called Deathloop, and it was just a CGI trailer that tells you barely anything about the game, but the concept at least looks interesting, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. They announced their technology called Orion, which is for game streaming, and I'm just sick of hearing game streaming this, game streaming that, because I know exactly what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is exert 100% control over whatever they want you to play. If they don't want you to play a particular game, they will kill that off of the streaming service and you will never be able to play it again. That is the end goal of game streaming. It's not to make it more convenient. It's not to make it so that you can actually play these games if you don't have the hardware for them. It's so that the producer has all of the control in the relationship between producer and consumer. And let's face it, if these companies did have 100% control in that relationship, it would become a very abusive relationship very quickly. Anyway, let's move on to the other three things they showed at the conference. They showed Ghostwire Tokyo, which actually looks really interesting. It's from the developers of The Evil Within, and I'm definitely looking forward to that, but it was just a CGI trailer that showed what the concept is and some of the art direction and such, and that all looks interesting, but I'm curious to see how the gameplay is. And then, of course, there are the two elephants in the room, Doom Eternal and Fallout 76. I'll go ahead and talk about Fallout 76 first, because what I'm about to say about it, I think most people are pretty much on board with. which is to say that the Battle Royale mode they announced is just stupid. And they announced that they're also going to be expanding the storyline and adding NPCs into the game that are actual humans instead of just robots and terminals. And then they tried to make a big deal out of the fact that all of the updates they're going to be releasing for Fallout 76 are going to be free updates. As if that's something that we should praise them for. Well, I got news for you, Bethesda. You don't get brownie points for finishing your fucking game. Cause I've played Fallout 76. I haven't finished it yet because I'm waiting for those updates. Because it's not a finished fucking product. It's a pre-alpha that they released for $60. And for all of you assholes out there who are all like, oh, you can just mod Bethesda games, it makes them so much better. Well, guess what? This is the end result of what you have been touting this entire time. Congratulations! You are responsible for them releasing broken products that are not finished, finishing them with updates later, and then acting like that's worthy of praise. I hope you're proud of yourselves. Because you are the ones that are proving Bethesda and other developers out there who do continue to do this kind of crap can get away with it. And you know what? Now's the perfect time to segue into Doom Eternal, because I'm pissed off from talking about Fallout 76, and I can actually cool off talking about Doom Eternal, because it doesn't piss me off as much as Fallout 76 does. So what did they show with Doom Eternal? Well, they did show some slight tweaks here and there to things like some of the weapons, and the interface being considerably larger and gaudier now, which hopefully you can turn that down, because that was pretty annoying. The Doomslayer now grunts when he gets hit, and it just sounds kind of odd. So hopefully they'll clean that up by the time the game launches. But then, of course, there's the big problem that I had with what they showed, which is to say that I'm pretty sure Doom is supposed to be a first-person shooter and not a first-person platformer with some shooting elements thrown in. Seriously, you could have put Super Mario sound effects over half of what they showed and it would have been perfectly appropriate. But my big concern with it is something that can't really be verified until I play the game for myself, which is how the guns feel, because the guns in Doom 2016 feel woefully underpowered, specifically because they were trying to make it so you would have to use the glory kills constantly. And it looks like they're doing the same thing here, but I can't be sure until I play it myself. So like with what happened with Doom 2016, I'm reserving full judgment until I can get my hands on the game and play it for myself, but I can at least confirm that the soundtrack is once again disappointing because it's Mick Gordon doing a bunch of low-effort gent, which just ends up being a bunch of obnoxious noise. And as was the case with Doom 2016, that is highly disappointing because I know that Mick Gordon is capable of so much better than that, yet he chooses not to be with this. Oh, and I'm sure those of you who are still salty about my Doom 2016 MTO probably didn't even notice the fact that I did use the word gent here, because I know what gent is. I knew what gent was when I made that MTO. I deliberately called it dubstep because gent is the guitar equivalent of dubstep. It's no effort, obnoxious noise. And Doom deserves so much better than that, it's downright painful. Anyway, moving on to the next conference now that I have talked about everything that was at the Bethesda Conference. Next up was the Devolver Digital show, which was basically just them openly mocking E3 in general, but also talking about some of the games they were doing. They have Devolver Bootleg, which is just silly, and it is actually a thing. It's on Steam. They showed an expansion for The Messenger. They showed a new game called Fall Guys Ultimate Knockout, which could be interesting. We'll have to wait and see on that. And they showed a light gun game, Enter the Gungeon House of the Gun Dead, which apparently is actually a thing, which is actually really cool. And they showed My Friend Pedro, which we already knew about, and we already knew it was going to release soon anyway. It does look interesting, but it's not the kind of game I'd really get the most out of. And then, of course, they showed the perfect game for eldritch horrors like myself called Carrion, which is basically an eldritch horror simulator. So obviously I'm going to have to take a look at that and see if they get the experience right. But those were really the only games that they talked about at the Devolver Digital show. It was mostly just them being ridiculous like they ordinarily are, and it was fairly amusing. The next big show was the PC gaming show, which I actually did not watch, because the Epic Games Store can go fuck itself. They have addressed really none of the major concerns about the store thus far, and it's still lacking even basic functionality, and yet they have the audacity to sponsor the PC gaming show, and still are going hard on the Epic Games Store exclusives. And all that's really doing is making me have even more contempt for Epic Games for what they have turned into, and actually having outright contempt for the developers who are taking that deal. I know I shouldn't blame them for taking the deal, because money is money, but it's still incredibly shady, it is blatantly anti-consumer, and it is blatantly anti-competitive. And it's even worse in the case of games like, say, Shenmue 3, which was announced to become an Epic Store exclusive in the PC show, and it's had a Steam store page for a while now. People were expecting to be able to get it on Steam, and in fact, they just released a backer survey about a week ago where they were just confirming which version of the game people wanted, and Steam was an option that I think most people who were getting it on PC selected. And now they can't get a Steam key because it's not going to release on Steam. And now they wanted refunds, and they can't get refunds. Yeah, this is just the latest instance of a Kickstarted game suddenly deciding to go Epic exclusive because of a big payout from Epic Games. It's incredibly shady for one, and it's basically just going to poison the well for crowdfunded games from here on out. And that's just not good for anyone. So I hope these developers are proud of themselves for basically screwing everyone over in the long run. So let's actually go ahead and get all of the Epic Store exclusives out of the way so I can actually talk about the things that weren't Epic Store exclusive. In case you're wondering, even though I didn't watch the show, I did actually keep track of all of the trailers that were released, and I watched the trailers themselves on their own, so I didn't actually support the actual PC gaming show. Anyway, so the first one they showed off was Chivalry 2. Which is hilariously out of touch because it's basically just Chivalry 1 with a nicer coat of paint. And Mordhau already exists, it's on Steam, it's a more complex combat system, and they're not screwing over their fan base by going Epic Store exclusive, so Chivalry 2 is just going to be dead on arrival. It's going to be really funny, actually. Then, of course, there's Zombie Army 4 Dead War, which... yet another fucking zombie game. But anyway, it's the fourth game in the Zombie Army series, which I guess is annoying if you were, for whatever reason, a fan of that series and you were hoping it was going to come out on Steam. It might be timed exclusive, but I don't think it is. Then, of course, there was Ancestors: The Humankind Odyssey, which is a year-long timed exclusive on the Epic Store, much like The Outer Worlds is. And again, I'm pretty sure that's because of the publisher Private Division, which also publishes The Outer Worlds, just screwing over everybody on that front. So, I guess we'll have to wait and see on that. It basically just means that it releases a year later for me anyway, and I wasn't that interested in it to begin with. And of course there was Auto Chess, which is apparently a thing now. I don't keep track of things that go on with Dota or League of Legends because I do not care about them in the slightest. So in this particular case, it's just means nothing to me. I know that Valve is working on a version of the whole Dota Auto Chess or whatever thing themselves, and that's going to come out on Steam, so I think people will probably just play that instead. Then, of course, there's Borderlands 3, which, again, couldn't care about if I tried, and something called Maneater, which is a new game from Tripwire Interactive, which is really disappointing. I was really hoping that Tripwire wouldn't be one of those developers that takes the Epic deal, but at least in that case, it is only a timed exclusive. It's a year-long exclusivity like with the others we've seen with the timed exclusives, and at least in some degree I can kind of understand it because they do use the Unreal Engine, and if you go with the Unreal Engine for your game, I believe that Epic gives you some extra benefits if you go ahead and stick with the Epic Game Store for a while. But it's still disappointing and it's still shady. But those were surprisingly the only games I saw that were explicitly Epic Game Store exclusive, whether that be timed exclusives or just permanent exclusives, and they just didn't say. And the other games that I saw either explicitly said they were on Steam, or they just didn't say which platforms they're on at all. And those included things like Evil Genius 2, which I'm surprised that they're coming back to that, but it is actually on Steam, so I will be taking a look at it eventually. There was Age of Wonders Planetfall, which I planned on looking at anyway, although I'm definitely not going to look at it before I do a review of all the Age of Wonders games leading up to that. There's a new game from the developers of Her Story called Telling Lies, and I'm sure I'll look at it eventually, but I'm not really excited for it. There was an upcoming expansion for Warframe, which I haven't played Warframe for a long time, and I'm surprised they're still making expansions for it, but hey, they're still making expansions for it. There was a new game called Genesis Noir that looks kind of interesting that I'll probably take a look at later on. There's a game called El Hijo, which I really didn't pay too much attention to. There was a Contra-like game called Valfaris, which I didn't really pay too much attention to because it's not really my thing. There was a base building game called Starmancer that looks kind of right up my alley, so I'll definitely be taking a look at that later. There was a game called Midnight Ghost Hunt, which is somewhat reminiscent of something like Ghostbusters, so I'm curious to see how that turns out, but otherwise, we'll just have to wait and see on that. There was Conan Chop Chop, which just looks stupid, so oh dear. There was Lost Oasis, which I didn't really pay too much attention to. There was Mosaic, which I didn't really pay too much attention to either. And there was Unexplored 2, The Wayfarer's Legacy. I didn't even know there was an Unexplored 1, so I'll have to take a look at that before I even really bother with Unexplored 2. And Remnant from the Ashes, which had been announced before, but I didn't really know much about it, and it doesn't look like something I'll be particularly interested in. There's a new Zoo Tycoon-esque game called Planet Zoo, which is good for those of you out there who were fans of Zoo Tycoon. There's Songs of Conquest, which is attempting to replicate the style of gameplay that was in Heroes of Might and Magic, and I didn't really care for Heroes of Might and Magic, so we'll see if I pick that up or not, but it's interesting to see somebody trying that sort of thing. There's a space strategy game called Per Aspera, which could be pretty interesting. There was also a JRPG-like game called Chris Tales, which could be interesting, but I'm not really all that interested in JRPGs, so it's on a pretty low priority for me. And there was Griftlands, which I did find out after the fact is actually an Epic Game Store exclusive now, which is quite disappointing. And they announced a new Versus mode for Warhammer Vermintide 2, which I'm amazed anybody still plays that. And then there were the two big things at this particular PC gaming show. The two things that I've been looking forward to, the first of which was announced before E3, and which they didn't show anything new of when the PC gaming show came around, which was Baldur's Gate 3. I am absolutely pumped for Baldur's Gate 3, but at the same time I'm very cautious, because my experience with Larian so far has been that they tend to do pretty okay on the writing side of things, but on the gameplay mechanic side of things, they can be really messy. Now, admittedly, I have not played very much of the two Divinity Original Sin games. I did play a couple of hours of Original Sin 1, but I couldn't really get into it. I don't know if that was just because I had only played a very brief portion of the game and it just gets better later on, or if it's just the fact that Divinity Original Sin is just not a particularly great game. I don't know yet because I haven't played enough of it, and I know that it's a really long game, much like Pathfinder Kingmaker is, so actually going through that game is going to take a lot of effort and it's going to be really annoying. So I definitely want to mess around with those first and try to get an idea for how Baldur's Gate 3 might be. I do know that they said it's going to be running on the latest version of the Dungeons & Dragons rule set. That'll be interesting to see because I haven't seen anything running 5th edition rules yet, and 5th edition is pretty simplified compared to most of the other editions, in fact. So we'll see how it is going from basically 3.5 in something like, say, Temple of Elemental Evil to 5th edition in Baldur's Gate 3, and they did say that they're also going to be doing a tabletop tie-in that is going to release prior to Baldur's Gate 3, so that'll be interesting to see. And then there was the other thing that I'm really looking forward to, which is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. A lot of people don't necessarily know this because I don't really do a huge amount with tabletop RPGs on my channel. That is something I've been trying to improve and add more of because I know that at least some of you out there are interested in the tabletop stuff, and particularly since I do mention it on occasion, you get curious about where I stand on that sort of thing. So I've been trying to expand the tabletop series more, but I haven't quite gotten to this yet, which is Vampire the Masquerade is my favorite tabletop role-playing game. Don't get me wrong, I like Dungeons & Dragons except for that one edition which shall not be named, I certainly like Pathfinder, I actually like Shadowrun a fair bit, and I friggin' love Cyberpunk 2020, and of course there are plenty of other systems I enjoy the living crap out of as well, but Vampire the Masquerade is by far my absolute favorite out of all of them, and that's impressive because there's some really, really good RPGs out there. But even aside from just being hyped up about it because of that, there's also the fact that the original Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was an absolutely fantastic game despite its faults, and to see that coming back, and coming back really full force, is really nice. I do have my concerns as to whether certain issues I have with 5th edition are going to find themselves in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, but we'll just have to wait and see on that. So far, they haven't really given the best indication as to whether or not that's going to be a problem, so I'm still certainly optimistic about Bloodlines 2, but there is still cause for concern, so we'll just have to wait and see on that. But it's still one of my most anticipated titles for next year, so I'm still pretty pumped. So that was what they discussed on the PC gaming show, so let's move over to the Ubisoft Conference that was next, where they actually didn't have a whole lot they showed. There were, of course, new updates for For Honor and Rainbow Six Siege, and, of course, updates for Tom Clancy's The Division 2, where they're going to be introducing new story content and such later on, which we already knew that anyway. And there was, of course, the thing that they announced a few weeks ago, but they hadn't really revealed too horribly much about, called Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which is starring John Bernthal, and they did have him on stage there, with a dog, in fact, and they talked about the game a bit and what you're going to be doing in it, but they still didn't reveal too horribly much about it, and I still need to finish quite a bit as far as the Ghost Recon reviews are concerned, so I'm not that concerned about Breakpoint for now. I definitely need to at least finish Wildlands first, but it's definitely something I'll look into once it's out, and probably I'll pick it up on sale. Then there was, of course, the thing that they teased a bit before E3, but they finally revealed actual gameplay and a lot of stuff about it, in fact, for Watch Dogs Legion. It's the new Watch Dogs game. It's set in London, and you can apparently play as anyone, which is actually legitimately interesting, and I'm curious to see how they pull it off, because that's a really ambitious thing to do mechanically, and they are already working in some pretty hilarious things like assassin grannies, so we'll just have to wait and see how it turns out. It's definitely not something I'm going to be picking up at full price, because that's not something I've done with any of the Watch Dogs games, and I actually still need to finish Watch Dogs 2 for that matter, but it's definitely something I'm looking forward to more than I was looking forward to Watch Dogs 2 after having played Watch Dogs 1. So that's something. They did reveal a new TV series from people who worked on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and that's called Mythic Quest Raven's Banquet. It looks really dumb and not at all entertaining. It's going to be on Apple TV, so I don't even care. Then, of course, there's the Assassin's Creed Symphony Tour, which is an interesting thing they're doing. It's an actual symphony, and it's going on tour, and they're playing Assassin's Creed music. So, that's kind of neat if you're into that sort of thing. There was the reveal of Rainbow Six Quarantine, which is actually a spin-off game based on a temporary mode they had in Rainbow Six Siege for a while, as part of an event they did, where you were basically going up against what are effectively zombies, and that seems to be the case here as well. It's not really something I'm looking forward to, because I am beyond sick of zombies, but if that's your kind of thing, then you might enjoy it. Then, of course, there was the annual installment of Just Dance, which apparently is in fact coming to the Wii, which still blows my mind. It's still a cringe factory, though. And they are introducing Adventure Time characters into Brawlhalla, which, whatever. Okay, whatever. And there's a sort of weird tactics kind of thing called Tom Clancy's Elite Squad, which just doesn't look particularly good. They revealed a new game from the developers who worked on the Assassin's Creed series, and it's called Gods and Monsters. It could be interesting. It looks kind of Zelda-esque, and I've been looking for more of that kind of thing, because the last Zelda game we got wasn't very Zelda-y, so we'll see how that goes. And then they, of course, unveiled their new Uplay Plus service, because, of course, everybody has to have subscription service now. And then they announced Roller Champions, which looks like it's not even remotely up my alley. So The Ubisoft Conference just wasn't very good this time around. It usually isn't particularly good anyway, but they just didn't have all that much to actually show, because most of what they showed was just updates that we already knew about anyway, and it was stuff that we already expected from either weeks or even months before. So that's a bit of a shame there. But then we move on to the Square Enix Conference, where weebs everywhere went completely berserk because there's actually a release date for the Final Fantasy VII Remake now. And they unveiled more about the combat system and such, so it actually looks like it might be something vaguely resembling playable now, which admittedly for the Final Fantasy series is really not saying much, but that's beside the point. In all seriousness though, Final Fantasy VII is easily one of the most overrated games I have ever seen. It is insanely boring, and even when it's not being insanely boring, the melodrama is so over the top that it's impossible to get invested in the story. It's a garbage story at that, and frankly the only reason people like it so much is that they're nostalgic for it. Because if you actually look at the game objectively, it's an absolute mess. It just happened to release at just the right time to make the right impression on just the right people at the time, so that people of a very impressionable age would be absolutely blown away by its pretty presentation that they hadn't really seen anything quite like it before, even though there were much better looking games out there at the time. I mean, again, I've always really been a PC gamer, so I had stuff like Quake at the time it came out, and frankly, Quake looks a hell of a lot better than Final Fantasy VII does. But again, you had a lot of people's introduction to the entire JRPG genre being Final Fantasy VII, so they immediately just thought it was the best thing ever, and it just kinda stuck, even though the game really doesn't deserve it. There are even other games in the Final Fantasy series that are better than it, like, say, Final Fantasy VI, which is better in every conceivable way except for visuals. In fact, actually, I would argue that the visuals are better than it, because they've aged a hell of a lot better. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent here. My point is that we have a release date for the Final Fantasy VII Remake. They made a big deal about it at the Square Enix conference, and of course the Square Enix fanboys were all screaming and acting like it was the most amazing thing in the universe. But I found it completely impossible to get excited about it, and I probably won't even take a look at the remake at all when it comes out, honestly. Unless I can get it for dirt cheap, there's really not much reason for me to bother with it, because I can't stand playing Final Fantasy VII to begin with. Although, I'll be fair, the change in the combat system may actually make it much more playable than the original version of the game, which has that god-awful turn-based system that absolutely plagues most of the early Final Fantasy games. Aside from that, there were a couple of other things that they went over that we pretty much expected because they had already been announced or that they were already actually out. For example, Octopath Traveler came out on PC, and it's available right now, actually. There was Life is Strange 2, which, again, is already out, and apparently has been doing okay, although I haven't played it myself yet. I still need to actually play the first game, but that's beside the point. They also had a bunch of Square Enix Collective stuff, much of which has already released. There's a bunch of their indie titles, and it's included things like, oddly enough, Battalion 1944, which has been out for about a week or two now, and hasn't gotten a particularly good response. I haven't really been looking forward to it because it's yet another World War II shooter, and I know it's trying to be basically Call of Duty all over again, but I don't know if I'll pick it up or not. We'll just have to wait and see. There was also the expected announcement of Kingdom Hearts 3 DLC and another expansion for Final Fantasy XIV. And then they did some other interesting things, like they're bringing Romancing Saga 3 and Saga Scarlet Grace Ambitions to the West, which I actually was not expecting. I thought most people had pretty much forgotten the Romancing Saga series exists. But hey, apparently they remembered, and Square Enix remembered and are bringing it over. That said, they still haven't brought the first Romancing Saga over, so that's a bit awkward, but whatever. Then, of course, there was Final Fantasy Brave Exvius War of the Visions, which, I don't know. It's another Final Fantasy thing. There was the announcement of Square Enix music being on streaming services, which is actually quite nice, because that is one thing that I can universally say they do well is soundtracks. They at the very least do that well across pretty much all of their games, so that's cool. They announced the Dragon Quest XI Definitive Edition and I don't really care because it's Dragon Quest, and I've never cared for Dragon Quest. It's just generic JRPG stuff. They announced Dragon Quest Builders 2, which, again, just doesn't look like something I would be interested in. They brought up The Last Remnant Remastered, which kind of blows my mind because I'm pretty sure almost everyone forgot that game exists, and for very good reason. What I played of it made absolutely no sense at all, and mechanically, it was basically me just staring at a screen and watching a bunch of numbers and words flash on the screen that meant absolutely nothing to me because literally all I was doing was just pressing X over and over and over again, and stuff was happening without really any of my input. So that's, I don't know, whatever. We'll see how that goes, I guess. Then they announced Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Remastered, which is actually interesting, because Crystal Chronicles was one of those games in the series that was pretty well received, but has since kind of fallen into obscurity because it was a GameCube game. And GameCube games tend to get forgotten, unfortunately, even though they actually were quite a few really good games on the GameCube. I really need to get around to reviewing some of those, but anyway, beside the point, the Crystal Chronicles Remastered could be interesting, we'll just see how it goes. There was also Circuit Superstars, which I don't really care, and something called Outriders, which was just a CGI trailer that meant basically nothing to me. There was Oninaki, which, I don't know, could be interesting, it could not be, we'll just have to wait and see. They announced a remastered version of Final Fantasy VIII, which just gives me a headache, because as bad as Final Fantasy VII can be, Final Fantasy VIII is worse. So the fact that it has a fan base big enough to warrant a remaster just is headache-inducing. But then they had their big show ender, which was Marvel's Avengers. And, I mean, it just looks like another superhero game. Yay! And by yay, I mean, okay, whatever. I actually just ordered a copy of Marvel's Spider-Man for the PS4. I haven't even played that yet. And I'm not really excited for Marvel's Avengers either. I mean, I like Avengers Endgame, in case you're curious. It was a decent movie, it had its moments, but I'm just not really excited for superhero stuff anymore. It's just kind of been done to death. So I guess we'll see how the game turns out, but again, not really looking forward to it all that much. It's just something that's kind of like, oh, okay, I'll pick it up if it's cheap, and that's about it. But that was pretty much it as far as the Square Enix conference went. They didn't really have a whole lot going on there. I mean, they did show Dying Light 2, because apparently they're distributing that. They're not publishing it, but they are distributing it in certain places. But it wasn't really anything we hadn't already seen. But then we had the next big conference being Nintendo the following day. And that's where things actually picked up a fair bit. They had a lot of stuff they wanted to get through, so they actually started things up. They introduced the Nintendo Direct, and then they were like, okay, let's go ahead and get into it. And they did. They just went right into it. Started things off with showing off the next DLC character for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which is the Dragon Quest hero. And then they showed that Dragon Quest XI Definitive Edition is coming to Switch. They showed a pretty extensive demo of Luigi's Mansion 3, so if you're into that, then that's definitely something you want to be looking into. I've never played any of the Luigi's Mansion games, I just never had them, and they didn't really appeal to me all that much, so I just never got one. But Luigi's Mansion 3 is on its way. I didn't even know there was a 2. But anyway, then they showed there's a new Dark Crystal game, which is interesting. It's a tactics game called Dark Crystal Age of Resistance Tactics. I might pick that up. We'll see. They showed off the remake of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. I still think the original is probably going to be the definitive edition of that game as far as I'm concerned. The new art style just really puts me off. I don't know what it is about it, but it just puts me off. Then they announced something actually pretty big, which is called Trials of Mana. And Trials of Mana is actually the Western title of Seiken Densetsu 3, which a lot of people forgot existed because it's actually Secret of Mana 2, in case you didn't know that. Between Secret of Mana and the next Mana release, there was Seiken Densetsu 3, which never made it over to the West. Now they've finally brought it over to the West as part of the Collection of Mana, which is available on the Switch now, and that is Final Fantasy Adventure, which is Seiken Densetsu 1, Secret of Mana, aka Seiken Densetsu 2, and the SNES version of Trials of Mana, also known as Seiken Densetsu 3. And I bring that up because they actually are working on a full-on remake of Trials of Mana that's going to be in 3D and everything like that is slated for release later on. But the Collection of Mana is actually on the eShop now. I actually went and took a look at it to see about picking it up, and they want $40 for it, which seems kind of insane for 3 old games. I mean, Final Fantasy Adventure was a Game Boy game, not even a Game Boy Color game, just a Game Boy game. The Secret of Mana was an SNES game, and Trials of Mana was a Super Famicom game, and I guess I could see charging a bit more for that one specifically because they did have to translate it recently. But at the same time, $40 for 3 old games seems pretty ridiculous. So I'll have to wait for that to go on sale, although it's the Nintendo eShop, nothing ever goes on sale. Anyway, it's just nice to see it coming over to the West, though. And then they followed that up with The Witcher 3 Complete Edition for the Nintendo Switch, which kind of blows my mind that they managed to cram Witcher 3 onto that thing. But it's cool. It means that you get to play Witcher 3 on the go, and if you didn't have an Xbox One or PS4 or a PC capable of handling it, then maybe if you have a Switch, then go ahead and pick it up and try it out. Because, I mean, The Witcher 3 is fantastic, and it includes all the expansions DLCs, too, so cool. Then there was, of course, Fire Emblem Three Houses, which I actually am going to be picking up as well. I am a fan of the Fire Emblem series. I have been for quite a while, and I'm looking forward to seeing how they do with that one, although the trailer for it was definitely not a particularly good trailer. They announced Resident Evil for the Switch, because Resident Evil has to be ported over to everything. They announced No More Heroes 3. Now, I still need to play the older No More Heroes games, but it's nice to see that they are actually doing a full-on sequel and really properly bringing back No More Heroes, as opposed to doing what they did with the previous game, which was Travis Strikes Again, I believe, or something like that, and that was very poorly received. But anyway, we'll see how that goes. There's Contra Rogue Core, which I was never really much of a Contra guy, but Contra Rogue Core just looks like more Contra, but modern. And they announced the Contra Anniversary Collection, which is also coming to PC, by the way, in case you didn't know that. That's nice if you've never played any of the old Contra games. The new game Demon Ex Machina, or Damon Ex Machina, I don't know how they want you to pronounce it, but it's a mech game, super anime. We'll see how that goes. I do like mech stuff, so it'll be interesting at least. They showed off the remake of Panzer Dragoon, which is going to be really interesting because I thought most people had forgotten that series even existed, including the publisher, but apparently they hadn't. And I'm more interested to see if they do either a remake or some sort of remaster or port or something of Panzer Dragoon Saga, because Panzer Dragoon Saga is basically impossible to find. Good luck actually finding a copy to begin with, let alone finding it for less than thousands of dollars. I do mean that, by the way. It'll be thousands of dollars if you find a copy. And those discs are slowly corroding. The Sega Saturn discs in particular were just notorious for corroding really easily. So we're losing Panzer Dragoon Saga as a game, and apparently it's a really good game. I've never played it myself. I've never knew anybody who actually played it. So we'll have to wait and see if they manage to do something with Panzer Dragoon Saga. That'd be way more interesting than just the original Panzer Dragoon, but it is nice to see Panzer Dragoon coming back. Then, of course, they mentioned Pokemon Sword and Shield. I don't care about Pokemon. Your mileage may vary. They showed off a bit of Astral Chain, which is looking to be a sort of hack and slash kind of game. Could be interesting. It's not really my genre of choice, but I do play them on occasion. I might pick it up if it's cheap. They showed off the new John Romero game, which is called Empire of Sin. It's the one that he's working on with Paradox Interactive, and it's a gangster-themed tactics game. I'm actually looking forward to this. I like tactics games. I like that era of history. It's just really interesting, so we'll see how they pull it off. They reiterated Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, which we already knew was going to happen. They brought up Cadence of Hyrule, which I'm not sure how that'll turn out. I'll probably pick up a copy because I'm kind of a sucker for anything Legend of Zelda, but we'll see how that goes. They announced the new Olympic Games for Mario and Sonic. It's Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games. Not really my kind of thing, but if people like that sort of thing, then it's definitely on their horizons now. Speaking of horizons, they announced the new Animal Crossing game, New Horizons, which I don't care about. I have never cared about the Animal Crossing series. I'm not part of the target demographic for it. I never claimed to be. I don't expect that it's anything I'll ever be interested in, so oh well. They showed off a bunch of stuff that is either just coming to the Switch and we already knew about it, or stuff that just needed to go quickly. So that included things like the Spyro Reignited trilogy, which is apparently also coming to PC, by the way. It's kind of interesting to know. Hollow Knight Silk Song for the Switch, Ni no Kuni for the Switch, which is interesting. I believe they're also bringing that to PC, but I'm not 100% sure on that yet. They showed off Minecraft Dungeons for the Switch, Elder Scrolls Blades for Switch, My Friend Pedro for Switch, Doom Eternal for Switch, The Sinking City for Switch, Wolfenstein Youngblood for Switch, Dead by Daylight for Switch, Alien Isolation for Switch, which, that's interesting. I didn't think they'd be able to cram that on the Switch either, but hey, they can. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Remastered for Switch, and Dragon Quest Builders 2 for Switch, Stranger Things 3 the game for Switch, Just Dance 2020, which we already mentioned before, Catan, which is a board game, and actually, Settlers of Catan is actually a really good board game, in case you don't know that. You might want to look into that if you're looking for something for board game night. New Super Lucky's Tale, which is a platformer kind of thing, Dauntless for the Switch, which Dauntless has been out for a while now, and Super Mario Maker 2, which we already knew was on its way. And then they closed out with two big announcements. The first of them was that Banjo-Kazooie is going to be the third DLC character for, I should say, Banjo and Kazooie are technically the third and fourth DLC characters, if they count as one character, whatever. For Smash Bros. Ultimate, that's actually a pretty big deal. I didn't think they were going to be able to do that, but hey, it's a thing that's happening, it's cool. And then they announced that there is a sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild in development. They don't even have a title for it yet, it's just the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So, I guess we'll see how that turns out. I, as a longtime Zelda fan, am very apprehensive about it, because I'm apparently one of the very few people on the planet who does not like Breath of the Wild. It's just not a Zelda game. Not really. It's more like a Souls game than anything else. And not even a particularly good Souls-like at that. So if they're going to win me over with the sequel to Breath of the Wild, then there's a few things they definitely need to do. The first of them is put some actual frickin' dungeons into the game. Because despite what a lot of people will tell you, there are actually no dungeons in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild at all. No dungeons. The closest thing you have to it is shrines, and they pale in comparison to actual Zelda dungeons. The next thing they need to do is actually put in proper progression, with actual puzzle progression, as opposed to giving you all of your tools at the very beginning, and there only basically being 5 of them. Which means that your actual puzzle solving ability is almost non-existent. Then they also need to, as far as I'm concerned, outright remove the weapon durability system, because that system is garbage, and if they don't want to remove it outright, then they at the very least need to extend the amount of durability that your items have, and they need to make them repairable, because otherwise, it's just obnoxious. It's one of the most infuriating aspects of Breath of the Wild, and I'm pretty sure pretty much everybody agrees with me on that. It is infuriating to just have to constantly be running around and be like, well shit, now my sword broke. What am I gonna do? Well, I guess I'll just have to pick up a stick. And then you whack the thing once with the stick, and then the stick just shatters like it's glass as well, and you're like, well, shit, now what? And then you just have to cheese the game out, and that's just irritating. So, they'd better fix that. And if they do those 3 things, then maybe I'll be on board with whatever Breath of the Wild 2 is called. But for now, it's a matter of, I don't know what to expect, because they didn't really show much of anything at all. It was just a tease that the game is happening, and they haven't confirmed any real details about it. So, we'll have to wait and see. I'm not really looking forward to it, considering my experience with Breath of the Wild, but I'll reserve final judgment until I actually get my hands on the game myself. So, again, we'll just wait and see on that. But that was the Nintendo conference in a nutshell. They just did a lot of stuff that we kind of expected, just ports of games that already exist for other systems, remakes, remasters, and a few new games that they were already talking about. They did not talk about Metroid Prime 4, unfortunately, although they did apparently restart development not too long ago, so they may just not have anything to show. So, we'll have to wait and see on that. I still actually need to play through that whole series. I only played a bit of the original Metroid Prime, but anyway. They did have a few other miscellaneous announcements that happened during the course of E3 that I did notice. Now, if I missed anything here, then definitely let me know in the comments. But what I did see was Darksiders Genesis, which is, well, it's just another Darksiders game as far as I'm concerned. I still haven't really played most of that series, actually. Haven't even picked up 3. I have 1 and 2. I haven't even finished 1 yet, so I got a lot of catching up to do on those. They did a bunch of stuff with Persona 5 Royal, which is just an updated version of Persona 5, which is also going to be on PS4. Apparently The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 3 is a thing. I hadn't even played the first one, so that's something I noticed. I did notice they're doing a new Stronghold game. It's called Stronghold Warlords. I am looking forward to it. It's set in Asia, and it looks interesting. They did a bit of a gameplay reveal, and they talked about some of the new stuff that's happening in it, and I am looking forward to it, although it's definitely a very cautious optimism, because Firefly Studios' recent record with the Stronghold series hasn't been the best. So we'll see how that goes, but it is something I'm looking forward to. There was a reiteration of Code Vein, which, whatever. There was Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts, which I'm amazed that series can keep going on. I don't know how they get their money, because I don't know anybody who buys them. So, apparently it has enough of a fan base to keep going, but whatever. I'll probably look at it eventually. And then there were HD remasters of Commandos 2 and Praetorians announced, and those are going to be interesting, because Commandos 2 is an absolute classic, and Praetorians is something I've never really managed to get working all that well, so it could probably benefit from an HD remaster. We'll have to wait and see how that goes, but it's definitely something that's on my radar at least. So that's everything I saw for E3 this year. Overall, E3 was just not particularly great. There were a few highlights here and there. Of course, the big reveal of Johnny Silverhand being in Cyberpunk 2077, and the release date, of course, being one of the biggest ones. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, absolutely pumped. Wasteland 3, absolutely pumped, but I already knew these were coming. In fact, most of the stuff that I went away from E3 wanting to pick up, I already knew I wanted to pick up anyway. It was stuff that I had seen going into E3, even months or years before, or in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, about a week before, and the brand new stuff that they're showing off just didn't really resonate enough with me to really make me want to go out of my way to learn more about them, or to pick them up whenever they're out. I mean, things like Ghostwire Tokyo look really interesting, but I'm just going to wait for more information on it, and I'm going to wait until I actually see some actual gameplay of it before I make any decisions there. And I actually still need to go back and play Evil Within 1 and 2. I have had them for quite a long while now, and I still haven't gotten around to playing them. So, it's things like that. I have a lot of catching up I need to do on a lot of these games, particularly with things that are follow-ups in series. So, like I mentioned before, I didn't even know Unexplored 2 was a 2. I didn't know there was a first Unexplored game, so I'd have to go back and play that first. And Evil Genius 2, I still need to finish the first Evil Genius. I started it, but I never finished it. And of course, with Age of Wonders Planetfall, I need to go back and do reviews of all 3 of the prior games. I've played up to Shadow Magic, but I never played the 3rd game, and so I need to play all those, do reviews on them. I have a lot of stuff I need to do before I start really thinking about follow-ups in series that I haven't really messed with already. And most of the brand new stuff is just not really appealing enough to make me want to go out of my way to pick them up. Now that said, I will pick them up when they're on sale, and then we'll mess around with them then, do reviews or MTOs depending on whatever the situation is. But suffice to say, E3 this year just wasn't all that great. It wasn't terrible or anything, it certainly wasn't as bad as certain years we've had, but at the same time, I can't really say I'm all that excited for what's coming up in 2020, other than maybe a handful of games that I was already interested in anyway. But before I move on to anything else, I really need to get this Kingmaker review done, because this thing has just been a thorn in my side for far too long at this point, and I just need to just finish it and get it over with. So that'll be the next big review. Until then, I'll be doing some MTOs on things like betas, or just things that I don't really have a whole lot to say about individually, and things like that. So stay tuned for those. Thanks for bearing with me over the past couple of weeks while I've been sick. Hope you appreciate my thoughts on E3 this year, and I will catch you all in later videos.